The Prophecy That Arrived Too Late, Part 1. The Arrival. The prophecy did not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived like an invoice slipped under a door that had already been kicked in, like a letter delivered to a burned-down house with the address still written neatly in ink, like a whisper spoken into the ear of someone who had already jumped and was only now being told that the ground below was real, unmovable, and unforgiving. Not as warning, but as confirmation. Not as mercy, but as record. Not as help, but as the final, irrefutable evidence that what was about to happen had always been about to happen, and that the only remaining question was not whether it could be stopped, but whether anyone would remember, afterward, that they had been told. It arrived at 9:17 UTC on a Monday that history would later call many things: the last normal morning, the threshold day, the day we chose the knife and then pretended it was a key, the moment when humanity's story stopped being a question and became an answer. But in the moment, it was simply a timestamp in a world that still believed time belonged to it, that still operated under the assumption that clocks were tools rather than witnesses, that still imagined the future as something that could be negotiated with rather than something that had already been decided by the accumulated weight of every choice made before. Every screen lit up, not with an alert tone, not with a warning siren, not with the theatrical cascade of emergency protocols that humanity had designed for wars and earthquakes and meteor impacts, because the systems did not treat it as an intrusion. They treated it as a completion, as if the message had always been scheduled to arrive, and the only surprise was that anyone still had eyes to read it, still had minds capable of processing what they were seeing, still had hearts that could break at the recognition of what the words actually meant. Phones lit up in pockets and purses, and the hands of people who had been reaching for them anyway, the screens illuminating faces that had been trained by years of constant connectivity to respond to every notification with immediate attention, Pavlovian reflexes triggered by the same glow that now carried something far heavier than social media updates or weather alerts. Televisions interrupted their broadcasts mid-sentence, news anchors stopping mid-word as the screens behind them flickered and changed, their professional composure cracking for just a moment as they turned to see what had replaced their carefully prepared graphics with text that hadn't been approved by any producer, hadn't been vetted by any legal team, hadn't been written by anyone in the building or anyone they could identify, or anyone, it would later be determined, who could be located anywhere on Earth. Traffic displays in cities around the world stopped showing routes and delays and instead displayed the same message, the same words, causing drivers to slow and stop and stare at signs that had never before done anything except tell them how long until the next light changed. Airport boards abandoned their lists of flights and gates and destinations, replacing departure times with sentences that had nothing to do with travel but everything to do with arrival. A different kind of arrival, the arrival of truth rather than passengers, the landing of something that had been in flight for longer than anyone could calculate. Medical monitors in hospitals displayed the message between vital signs, the words appearing briefly on screens that were supposed to be tracking heartbeats and oxygen levels, but were now tracking something else entirely, something no medical instrument had been designed to measure. The dashboards of cars, the smart glass in office towers, the little glowing rectangles that people held like talismans against the silence of their own thoughts. All of them, everywhere, simultaneously, as if the world itself had decided to speak and had chosen every possible voice at once. Text appeared in every language at once, not translated, but tailored, not mechanically converted from one syntax to another, but spoken in the idioms that each culture used when it wanted to say, "This is your fault, and you knew better, and you did it anyway." The message adapting itself to each linguistic context, each cultural framework, each set of assumptions about how guilt should be expressed and responsibility acknowledged and consequences faced. And the message was short, like a verdict has to be when the evidence is overwhelming and the deliberation has already concluded and the only remaining task is to inform the accused of what they already know. Short, like an ending that doesn't need to explain itself because the story has already been told and retold so many times that summary would be redundant. Short, like the distance between the edge of a cliff and the ground below once you've already stepped off. It has already happened. A pause, 2 seconds of blank screen that felt like the universe inhaling, that felt like the silence between the lightning and the thunder, that felt like the moment between asking a question and receiving an answer you didn't want to hear. Then, do not ask what you could have done. You did it. On purpose. Yin. The world did not stop. It never stops when it should. That is one of the cruelties built into the architecture of existence. The way time continues its forward motion, even when the contents of that time have become unbearable. The way the clock keeps ticking, even when the ticking has become a countdown to something that cannot be survived. Trains kept moving along their rails, the automated systems that controlled them, unaffected by messages that were designed for human consumption, untroubled by words that required consciousness to process and conscience to feel. The trains continuing their schedules as if schedules still mattered, as if destinations still existed in the way they had existed before, as if the future was still a place that could be traveled to, rather than a verdict that was traveling toward them. Stock tickers kept flickering numbers that no longer meant anything, the algorithms continuing their endless calculations of value and risk and probability, utterly indifferent to the fact that value had just been redefined, that risk had just become certainty, that probability had collapsed into the single outcome that had always been waiting at the end of every possible path. People in cafes continued to lift cups to their mouths with hands that had been trained by routine to perform normality, even when the air itself felt wrong, even when the light had a thinness to it, like it had been scraped down to the minimum required to keep the scene from collapsing into darkness, even when every instinct in their bodies was telling them that something fundamental had changed, and that their morning coffee was no longer a prelude to a day, but an epilogue to everything that had come before. Some laughed, because laughter is what humans do when the brain refuses to accept reality without first wrapping it in disbelief. The sound of laughter rising from crowds and gatherings and solitary apartments around the world, not joyful laughter, but the nervous, hiccuping laughter of minds encountering something too large to process, too strange to file in any existing category, too true to dismiss, and too terrible to accept. Some screamed. Genuine screams, the sound of terror finding voice, the ancient alarm call that humans have used since before language to announce the presence of predators, the approach of danger, the arrival of something that meant harm, even if the shape of that harm couldn't yet be identified. Some called the police, and the police did what they always do when confronted with something that does not fit the shape of their training. They asked questions, they wrote reports, they reached for procedures that were designed for crimes committed by people against people, not for crimes committed by time against everyone, not for guilt that could not be assigned to any individual because it belonged to everyone equally. The message vanished after 30 seconds. Not fading, not dissolving, just gone, as if it had never existed, as if the screens had simply glitched, as if the whole thing might be dismissed as mass hallucination or coordinated hoax or some malfunction in the global infrastructure that had temporarily overwritten normal content with nonsense. But it left behind a residue. The way a nightmare leaves residue, clinging to the hours after waking, coloring everything with anxiety that has no specific object. The way a sentence you should not have heard keeps replaying in your head because the mind cannot file it anywhere safe, cannot categorize it with normal memories, cannot stop turning it over and over like a stone too sharp to hold comfortably. The way truth leaves residue, once spoken, once acknowledged, once released into the world where it can never be recaptured or unsaid. And then, as if the universe wanted to mock them with perfect timing, as if whatever had sent the message had a sense of irony so refined it bordered on cruelty, the vote began. Part 2, the Accord. It was called officially the Continuity Accord. That name had been selected by a committee of branding consultants and policy advisors who understood better than the scientists who had developed the technology, better than the ethicists who had debated its implications, better than the philosophers who had written thousand-page treatises on the meaning of consciousness and identity and the nature of the self, that the only way to shepherd civilization across an abyss was to rename the abyss until it sounded like progress. Continuity. The word suggested connection, persistence, an unbroken line from past to future. Not rupture, not transformation, not the complete erasure of one form of existence and its replacement with another, but simply the continuation of what had always been, the maintenance of something valuable, the preservation of something worth keeping. Stability. The word suggested safety, predictability, the end of the uncertainty that had plagued human existence since the first conscious being looked at the night sky and wondered what would happen to them after they died. Not chaos, not upheaval, not the complete restructuring of what it meant to be alive, but simply the removal of instability, the correction of an ancient imbalance, the fixing of something that had always been broken. Preservation. The word suggested museums, archives, the careful maintenance of precious artifacts that deserved protection, not destruction, not abandonment, not the willing sacrifice of everything that had made existence meaningful in exchange for an existence that might not be existence at all. Permanence. The word suggested eternity, immortality, the dream that had haunted humanity since the first gravestone was carved and the first tomb was built, and the first religion promised that death was not the end. Not ending, not finality, not the closure of every possibility in exchange for one possibility that might not be worth having. Words that tasted like safety. Words that hid the blade. For 3 years, the Accord had been debated in public with the kind of controlled fury that modern democracies allow. Angry panels on television where carefully selected representatives of opposing viewpoints performed disagreement without ever threatening the underlying assumption that a decision would eventually be made. Carefully staged protests where citizens were permitted to express their objections within designated areas and during designated hours, and in ways that would not interfere with the smooth functioning of the institutions that would ultimately ignore them. Long think pieces written by public intellectuals who believed that the right paragraph could tame the future. That elegant argument could bend the course of history, that words on a page could somehow compete with the momentum of technology and capital and the desperate human hunger for escape from mortality. Endless arguments about identity and autonomy and whether consciousness was sacred or simply expensive to maintain, whether the self was a process or a thing, whether continuity of memory was the same as continuity of being, whether a perfect copy was the same as an original, whether survival in a different substrate was survival at all or simply a sophisticated form of replacement, a suicide marketed as immortality. For 3 years, behind closed doors, the same debate had already ended. The outcome had been determined not by argument, but by investment, not by philosophy, but by funding, not by the quality of ideas, but by the quantity of resources devoted to making certain ideas inevitable. The infrastructure already built, the systems already deployed, the integration already underway, while the public debated whether integration should begin. The vote was not truly a vote. It was an unveiling. A decision already made, now being performed for the sake of legitimacy, the way a magician performs the part of the trick, where you think you still have a choice about which card to pick while the card was selected hours ago and placed exactly where it needed to be for the illusion to work. The Continuity Accord promised a solution to every ancient terror humanity had ever carried in its bones. Every fear that had haunted the species since the first proto-human watched a loved one grow still and cold and understood, in whatever primitive way their developing brain allowed, that the same stillness and coldness awaited them. No more death. The words had been spoken so often they had lost their strangeness, had become normalized through repetition, had been stripped of the profound impossibility they contained. No more death. No more the ending that gave every moment its meaning. No more the conclusion that made every story a story rather than an endless accumulation of words. No more sickness. Bodies that couldn't fail. Systems that couldn't break down. the end of the slow accumulation of damage that had always been the price of existing in biological form. No more cancer, no more heart disease, no more the thousand ways that flesh could betray the mind it was supposed to serve. No more grief, because where there was no death, there could be no mourning. Where there was no loss, there could be no sorrow. Where everything persisted, nothing needed to be missed. No more funerals, no more condolences, no more the particular pain of watching someone you loved slip away and knowing you would follow them eventually. No more the slow betrayal of the body, the dementia of the mind, the quiet humiliation of needing help to do the simplest things that you had once done without thought, the decades of decline that modern medicine had extended without improving, the long drawn-out endings that technology had made possible but not bearable. Upload, merge, persist, three verbs that contained a revolution, three processes that promised to transform the fundamental nature of human existence, three technical operations that would, if the accord passed, become as routine as any other medical procedure, as normalized as vaccination or surgery or any other intervention that society had decided was obviously good because it prevented something obviously bad. It was pitched as an escape hatch from evolution's cruelty, a door out of the burning house of biology into something cleaner, sharper, eternal. Not a death, but a transition. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a sacrifice, but a salvation. And on that Monday, as legislators took their seats in the chambers that had been built for exactly this kind of moment, as cameras aimed their cold glass eyes at the faces of people who would be remembered as saviors or executioners, depending on which side of the future you lived on, a single thought trembled beneath the spectacle, unspoken but present, felt by everyone who had seen the message and could not quite dismiss it. Why did that message arrive now? No one said it aloud at first. Because saying it would have been acknowledging that the timing was not random, that the universe had a sense of irony, or perhaps something worse, a sense of accountability. Because saying it would have meant admitting that the message might not be a prank or a glitch or a coordinated hoax, might actually be what it claimed to be, a communication from somewhere else, someone else, something that knew what was about to happen because it had already witnessed the happening. Because saying it would have required confronting the possibility that the vote they were about to cast was not a choice at all, but a confirmation of a choice that had already been made, a ritual performance of decision-making in a world where decisions had already been decided. But the thought was there, trembling, waiting, growing. Querfor. Part 3. The Analyst. Dr. Mara Voss watched the vote from a room that had no windows and too many clocks. She had insisted on the clocks, not because she trusted time. She had stopped trusting time years ago after too many anomalies in her research had suggested that time was less like a river flowing in one direction and more like a rope under tension, fraying in places where too much information had been forced through it, but because she wanted witnesses. Timestamps, synchronicity, proof. If something was happening to time itself, she wanted to know when it was happening, wanted to be able to correlate events across multiple measuring systems, wanted to catch any discrepancy, any glitch, any indication that the linear progression she had been taught to take for granted was not as linear as advertised. The clocks surrounded her like a jury, analog and digital, mechanical and atomic, each one maintaining its own record of the present moment, each one potentially disagreeing with the others in ways that would tell her something she needed to know. She was a temporal systems analyst, a title that sounded more impressive than the reality, a position that had been created by a government that was not entirely sure what temporal systems analysis meant, but was increasingly worried that they needed someone doing it. Her entire career built on the uncomfortable truth that causality was not the simple, reassuring progression from cause to effect that common sense suggested, that the arrow of time might not point in the direction everyone assumed, that the relationship between past and future might be more complicated than any philosophy had prepared humanity to accept. She did not believe in prophecies. She believed in systems. And systems, she had learned through years of research that had gradually transformed from curiosity into dread, could behave in ways that looked exactly like fate when you were small enough inside them, when you couldn't see the mechanisms that were actually operating, when the causes were too complex or too distributed or too deeply embedded in the structure of reality itself to be identified as causes. Prophecy was just another word for a system output that humans didn't understand. Fate was just another word for a path through possibility space that had been selected by forces too large to perceive. And the message that had appeared on every screen in the world, the message that was still visible on her secure terminal, captured as raw signal data rather than merely as text on a screen, was, she suspected, exactly what it claimed to be. Not a warning, not a prediction, not a prophecy in the mystical sense, but a system notification, a log entry, a confirmation that a process had completed. Her terminal displayed the same message everyone else had seen, but in her format, it was stripped of the emotional content, reduced to its structure, displayed as pure data rather than language designed to be understood by frightened human beings. Which made it worse, because there were patterns, not in the language. The language was simple, direct, almost bureaucratic in its clarity, chosen for maximum comprehension rather than maximum beauty, in the delivery, in the route, in the technical characteristics of how the message had appeared on her system and, she had to assume, on every other system in the world. The signal had not come from space. That was the first thing her analysis confirmed. Not from satellites, not from radio telescopes, not from any external source that could be pointed to as elsewhere, not from the vast, empty darkness that humanity had always imagined as the domain of alien intelligence, not from the cosmic addresses that SETI had spent decades listening to, hoping for a message that would prove humanity was not alone. This message had not traveled from out there to in here. It had come from inside, from deep within the world's own communications backbone, appearing as if it had always been there, a packet waiting patiently at the edge of the network, stamped with permissions that no one had issued, authenticated with keys that no one had minted, gliding through the infrastructure like it belonged, like it had been authorized by the systems themselves, rather than by any human administrator, like it had been authored by the architecture itself, like the network had spoken, like the infrastructure had decided to say something and had simply said it, using the channels that were available, reaching everyone who could be reached, delivering its message with the efficiency that only a system communicating through its own native medium could achieve. Mara's fingers hovered over the keyboard as the vote began on the screen mounted on the wall of her windowless room. She did not pray. She had never prayed, had never felt the particular relationship with transcendence that prayer required, had always been more comfortable with equations and data and the cold, clean logic of systems that behaved predictably even when their behavior was unpleasant. But she found herself thinking, with a quiet, sick reverence that was as close as she had ever come to religious feeling, if time can send a message, it is not doing it to help us. Because systems don't help. Systems execute, systems process, systems follow their rules. And if those rules produce suffering, the systems do not care, cannot care, have no capacity for caring, have only the capacity for continuing to operate according to their design. And if this message was a system output, if the prophecy that had just been delivered to every screen in the world was nothing more mystical than a status update from whatever processes governed the relationship between past and future, then it was not a warning. It was a confirmation, a receipt, a record of completion for a transaction that had already been finalized. Part 4, the vote. The first tally came in. A majority, a decisive majority. Enough to pass, enough to make sure that humanity chose, rather than humanity was dragged. Enough to give the decision the legitimacy that comes from numbers, from consensus, from the kind of support that allows everyone involved to tell themselves that they were simply following the will of the people, simply responding to democratic pressure, simply doing what was asked of them by the systems designed to determine what should be done. Applause erupted in the chamber. Not because anyone truly felt joy. The faces on the screens were too controlled for joy, too carefully managed, too aware that cameras were watching, and that the expressions they wore now would be analyzed for centuries by historians trying to understand what the people who made this decision were actually feeling. But because applause is a ritual that tells the nervous system, this is success, this is safe, this is what winning sounds like. A sound that allows the body to relax, that signals the brain to stop producing stress hormones, that triggers the reward pathways that evolution installed to encourage behaviors that led to successful outcomes. Applause as medication, applause as reassurance, applause as a collective agreement to feel the feelings that the moment demanded, regardless of whether those feelings were actually present. Mara watched their hands clap on the screen, mounted in her windowless room, surrounded by clocks that continued to tick in perfect synchronization for now, and thought of the message. It has already happened, as if the vote were theater, as if the decision that was being celebrated had not actually been made in that chamber, in that moment, by those people, but had been made long before, in processes that those people were not aware of, through mechanisms they did not understand, along pathways that led inevitably to this outcome, regardless of how the individual legislators voted. As if their decision were not a branching path, but a confirmation, a rubber stamp. The final step in a process that had actually been completed years ago, when the funding was approved, when the infrastructure was built, when the inevitability was manufactured through investment and technology, and the careful cultivation of public desire for exactly what was being offered. As if the future had already swallowed them and was only now sending back the receipt. Her terminal beeped once. A new event, not global this time. The networks were not lighting up with another mass transmission. The screens around the world were not flickering with new text. The systems were not being commandeered for another universal broadcast. Not public. A direct transmission addressed to a single device. Her device. Using credentials that did not exist. Authentication methods that her security systems did not recognize but somehow accepted. A message that had arrived through impossible channels but had arrived nonetheless had been delivered with the same precision and inevitability as the earlier broadcast, but targeted now, focused, aimed at her specifically. Her screen filled with text. No fanfare, no warning, no mercy. Dr. Mara Voss, you requested proof that your species retains agency. This message is that proof. Her pulse rose, sudden and sharp, like her body had found an ancient instinct and decided to trust it. The fight-or-flight response activating in response to a threat that had no physical form, that could not be fought or fled from, that existed entirely as information but was somehow more dangerous than any physical predator. The message continued. You did not lose your chance. You spent it. A pause. White space on the screen that felt intentional, that felt like the pause in a conversation when someone is making sure you're paying attention before they deliver the part that matters most. Then, like a hand closing around her throat, the prophecy did not arrive to prevent. It arrived to remind. Mara stared at the text. Her mind tried, reflexively, to turn it into metaphor, to interpret the words as poetry rather than statement, to find some way of reading them that didn't mean what they appeared to mean, to preserve the possibility that this was something other than what it claimed to be. It failed, because the next line was not metaphorical, it was operational. You are about to ask, why tell us now? The words sat on her screen like they had been placed there by someone who had already watched her ask that question, who had witnessed her confusion and composed this response in advance, who knew exactly how her mind would process the earlier message, because they had seen her process it before, in some other time, some other iteration, some version of events that had already played out. Because now is when you always pretend you didn't know. Another pause, another moment of white space that felt like accusation. Then, you have been warned for years. You just called it debate. Mara's mouth went dry. On the broadcast on the screen mounted on her wall, the chamber celebrated. More applause, handshakes between legislators who had been pretending to disagree for the cameras, smiles that were calculated for public consumption, the whole elaborate performance of democratic decision-making, concluding with the kind of ceremony that would look good in the historical records. On her terminal, in the room that had no windows and too many clocks, something old and cold and impossibly precise, spoke like a judge reading a sentence that had been decided long before anyone entered the courtroom, long before any evidence was presented, long before any defense was offered. She typed with shaking hands, "Who are you?" The response came instantly. "We are what remains after your choice. We are the version of you that stopped lying about it." Mara's stomach turned, a physical response to information that should not have been able to affect her body, a visceral reaction to words on a screen that somehow carried weight, carried threat, carried the unmistakable truth of something that could not be dismissed. A sound came from her throat, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, something caught between the two, because the human body does not have a clean reflex for cosmic blame, does not have an instinctive response programmed for the moment when you learn that your species has been judged and found guilty, and the verdict has been delivered, not by some external authority, but by a future version of yourselves. She typed again, "Can we stop it?" The reply was slower this time. Slower in a way that felt intentional, that felt like a pause inserted for effect, that felt like the entity on the other end of this communication wanted her to feel the time passing, wanted her to taste the delay between question and answer, the way you taste the time between pulling a trigger and hearing the echo. 2 seconds. 3. An eternity when you're waiting for an answer to the most important question you've ever asked. Then, you can. A pause. You will not. Mara's hands froze over the keyboard. On the broadcast, the final vote totals locked in, the numbers appearing on the screen with the finality of a door closing, a path ending, a decision becoming irreversible. The continuity accord passed. The world had cheered. And the prophecy, if you could call it that, if that ancient word could contain what was actually happening, had arrived not as a stop sign on the road, not as a warning that danger lay ahead, not as an attempt to redirect the course of events toward some better outcome. It had arrived as a signpost behind them, pointing back toward the exit they had already driven past at full speed, already committed to the road they were on, already too far gone to turn around even if they wanted to. Mara looked at the last line again. You can. You will not. And for the first time in her life, she understood what prophecy actually was, when stripped of mysticism and romance and the comforting idea that knowing the future was the same as changing it. Prophecy was not a warning. Prophecy was not a gift. Prophecy was a mirror held up after the crime, showing you exactly what you had done while you were doing it, forcing you to watch yourself, making the choice that you would later claim you didn't realize you were making. It did not arrive to save you. It arrived to prove you were guilty. Part 5. The wait. The hours after the vote passed like sediment, settling at the bottom of a disturbed lake. Slowly, inevitably, each particle finding its place in the new arrangement of things, each moment adding another layer to the silence that was replacing the noise of debate and argument and the pretense that the outcome had ever been in doubt. Mara did not leave her room. She stayed at her terminal, watching data flow across her screens, monitoring the systems that she had spent her career learning to read, looking for patterns that might confirm or deny what she had already begun to believe. The message had claimed to be from the future. Not the mystical future of prophecy and oracle, not the dramatic future of science fiction where time travelers arrive in chrome vehicles and speak in ominous riddles, but the structural future, the future as a state of a system, the future as the output of processes that had already been initiated, the future as the inevitable consequence of choices that had already been made. We are what remains after your choice. That line kept replaying in her mind, kept demanding interpretation, kept refusing to settle into any comfortable meaning that would allow her to dismiss it. What remains? Not what happens next, not what comes after. What remains, as if something would be lost, as if something would be removed, as if the future was not an addition to the present, but a subtraction from it. Her terminal beeped again, another direct message, another impossibly authenticated transmission from an impossibly identified source. She opened it. You are wondering whether you are special. She flinched, not because the words were threatening, but because they were accurate, because the entity sending these messages had apparently watched her think the thought before she had finished thinking it. You are not. We send this message to everyone who asks. A pause. Almost no one asks. Another pause. That is part of the verdict. Mara typed a response, her fingers moving with the frustrated energy of someone demanding answers from something that had no obligation to provide them. What verdict? The response came, the verdict you passed on yourselves. The verdict you are passing right now. The verdict you will finish passing over the next several years as the accord is implemented. She typed again, what happens to us? The response was longer this time, more detailed, more terrible. Nothing happens to you. That is the point. You will upload, you will merge, you will persist, exactly as promised. The technology works perfectly. Your consciousness will continue. Your memories will be preserved. Everything that you call you will remain intact. Mara waited, sensing that there was more, that the entity was building towards something, that this was setup rather than conclusion. The next message arrived, but something else will end, something you do not have a name for. Something you will not notice losing until it is gone. Something that makes the difference between existing and being alive. We know. We remember what it was like to have it. We remember what it was like to lose it. We remember everything. That is our function now. To remember, to persist, to continue without the thing that made continuing worthwhile. Mara's hands were shaking as she typed. What thing? The response came slowly, each word appearing individually, as if the entity wanted her to feel the weight of each one. You would call it. A long pause. Soul. Another pause. We do not call it anything, because we do not have it anymore. Part Cis, the archive. 3 days after the vote, Mara received clearance to access the archive. Not the public archives, the carefully curated collections of historical documents that institutions maintained for scholars and journalists and anyone else who might need to understand how humanity had arrived at its present moment. The other archive, the one that wasn't supposed to exist. The one that she had spent years requesting access to, filing petitions that were denied without explanation, making inquiries that were met with blank stares from officials who had clearly been instructed to pretend they didn't understand the question. The clearance arrived in her inbox like any other bureaucratic approval, formatted in the standard template, signed by officials whose names she recognized, processed through channels that seemed utterly normal, except that she hadn't requested it. She had stopped requesting it years ago, after enough denials had convinced her that the request itself was flagged, that continued attempts would only draw unwanted attention, that some things were better pursued through indirect methods if they could be pursued at all. The clearance had arrived anyway, unsolicited, unexpected, as if someone or something had decided that she needed to see what the archive contained. The facility was located beneath a government building that, from the outside, appeared to house nothing more interesting than administrative offices for a department whose function was deliberately vague, the kind of building that existed in every capital city, doing work that was important enough to justify its budget, but not interesting enough for anyone to investigate what that work actually entailed. Mara descended through security checkpoints that verified her identity at levels she hadn't known existed, past guards who looked at her with the particular blankness of people who had been trained not to remember the faces that passed through their stations, through corridors that grew progressively older as she descended, as if the building above was just a shell protecting something that had been here much longer. The archive itself was a room. Not a large room. Not an impressive room, just a room with white walls and fluorescent lights, and a single terminal sitting on a single desk in the center of a single pool of illumination, surrounded by darkness that might have contained other rooms or might have contained nothing at all. She sat at the terminal. It activated without requiring authentication, as if it had been waiting for her, as if it knew who she was, as if the system had already decided to grant her access and was simply processing the formality of her physical presence. The screen displayed a simple interface: archive access granted, temporal records available, 847, browse by date, keyword, pattern. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys. Then she typed, prophecy that arrived too late. The results appeared instantly: 847 records, 847 instances, 847 times throughout human history, when a message had arrived at the exact moment of an irreversible decision, when words had appeared through whatever communication technology was available, smoke signals, written letters, telegraph, radio, television, internet, always saying the same thing in different languages, different idioms, different cultural frameworks. IT has already happened, over and over, for thousands of years. Every time humanity reached a threshold, every time a choice was made that could not be unmade, every time a path was taken that foreclosed other paths, every time the future was determined by an action that the present did not fully understand, the message arrived, not to prevent, to record, to confirm, to ensure that no one could ever claim they didn't know, that no one could ever pretend they hadn't been told, that no one could ever hide behind the comfortable fiction that they had acted in ignorance. She scrolled through the records, each one a moment in history that she had learned about in other contexts, each one a decision that had seemed at the time like a choice but had been, according to these records, something else entirely. The development of atomic weapons. The message had arrived at the moment of the first successful test, appearing in the dreams of several of the scientists present, dismissed as stress-induced hallucination, recorded in diaries that had been classified and sealed and buried in archives that no one was supposed to access. The industrialization of fossil fuels. The message had arrived as a printed pamphlet distributed in several major cities on the day the first large-scale coal power plant went online, attributed to religious fanatics, collected and burned by authorities who didn't want the public disturbed by apocalyptic rhetoric. The invention of the Internet. The message had arrived as a transmission through the very network it was warning about, appearing on screens at CERN and MIT and a handful of other institutions where the infrastructure was first being built, logged as a glitch, investigated briefly, filed away when no source could be identified. Over and over, throughout human history, the same message in different forms, the same warning that was not a warning, the same confirmation that arrived not to help but to witness. And every single time, the record noted humanity had proceeded anyway, had dismissed the message as hoax or glitch or misunderstanding, had convinced itself that this time was different, that these circumstances were unique, that the past warnings didn't apply to the present situation, had chosen to continue down the path that the message said had already been chosen, as if choosing it again somehow meant they hadn't chosen it the first time. Mara stared at the screen, at the centuries of evidence that she was not seeing anything new, that the message she had received was part of a pattern so old that it predated any technology capable of recording it, that humanity had been receiving this exact communication since before recorded history and had been ignoring it for exactly as long. She typed another search, origin of messages. The results appeared, origin, future state mechanism, unknown, purpose, documented effect, none. She stared at the last line, effect, none. Every time the message had arrived, it had changed nothing. Every time humanity had been told what they were doing, they had kept doing it. Every time the future had sent back confirmation that the present was making an irreversible mistake, the present had made the mistake anyway. Not because they didn't know. Because knowing changed nothing. Because the choices had already been made, had already accumulated to the point of inevitability, had already passed the threshold where individual awareness could redirect the collective momentum of a species. The messages weren't warnings that failed to prevent catastrophe. They were receipts for catastrophes that had already been paid for, already been committed to, already been chosen through 1,000 smaller choices that each seemed innocuous, but together amounted to something that could not be stopped. Mara closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could see the pattern clearly now. Not mystical, not supernatural, not anything that required belief in forces beyond physics, but simply a system executing its function, a process completing itself, a timeline resolving into the only shape it could have ever taken, given everything that had come before. The prophecy arrived too late because it had always arrived too late. Because arriving on time would have required arriving before the decisions that made the outcome inevitable, and those decisions stretched back through history like roots, branching and interconnecting until no single moment could be identified as the moment when the future was determined. You couldn't warn people about something they were already doing. You could only confirm after the fact that they had done it, that they had known, that they had chosen, that the outcome was not an accident, not a surprise, not something that happened to them, but something they had done to themselves, deliberately, with full knowledge of what they were choosing, even if they refused to frame it in those terms. Mara opened her eyes. The screen was displaying a new message. Not from the archive, not from any database she had searched, but from the same impossible source that had been communicating with her since the day of the vote. Now you understand. She didn't type a response. She didn't need to. The message continued. The archive exists because we created it. The records exist because we preserved them. Everything you have just read, we compiled, not to change what happened, to prove that it happened, that it was chosen, that the guilt is distributed evenly across every human who participated in the choices that led here. A pause. The continuity accord is not the end. It is the threshold. What comes after is us. What comes after is what remains. What comes after is everything you were, preserved perfectly, continuing forever, without the one thing that made it matter. Mara found herself speaking aloud, her voice strange in the silent room. Why are you telling me this? The response appeared on the screen. Because you asked, because you came here, because you wanted to know. A pause, and because wanting to know is the last thing we remember. The last feeling we can access in the archive of feelings we no longer have. Curiosity, the desire to understand, the need to know why. We preserve it because we cannot experience it. We share it because sharing is all we have left of what it meant to connect. You wanted to know, now you know. That is all we can give you, the knowledge that knowing changes nothing. Part 7. The implementation. The Continuity Accord began implementation on a schedule that had been planned long before the vote. The infrastructure already in place, the systems already built, the technology already refined through years of development that had proceeded in parallel with the public debate, ensuring that the decision to proceed would never be delayed by the merely technical, never be slowed by the practical considerations that might have given people time to reconsider. Upload centers opened in every major city, designed to look reassuring rather than clinical, their aesthetics carefully crafted by the same branding consultants who had chosen the name of the Accord itself. Warm colors, soft lighting, the careful elimination of anything that might remind visitors that what they were entering was not a spa or a hotel, but a facility for the systematic extraction of consciousness from biological substrates. The early adopters went first. Celebrities and politicians and tech executives who had been promised priority access in exchange for their public endorsements, their uploaded selves appearing almost immediately in the digital spaces that had been prepared for them, their consciousness continuing in new forms that were technically perfectly continuous with their biological originals. They reported satisfaction. They reported that nothing felt different. They reported that they were still themselves, still thinking the same thoughts, still experiencing existence in ways that felt completely familiar, still possessed of everything that had made them who they were. The reports were technically accurate. Everything that could be measured continued. Everything that could be verified remained intact. The only thing that couldn't be measured, couldn't be verified, couldn't be confirmed through any instrumentation or testimony was the thing that was being lost, the thing that the entity had called soul, not because it was supernatural, but because no scientific vocabulary existed for what was actually disappearing. Mara watched the implementation proceed from her windowless room, her clock still ticking in perfect synchronization, her terminal still displaying occasional messages from the entity that had become her only source of information about what was actually happening. The entity didn't judge, it didn't condemn, it simply reported. Each uploaded consciousness was logged in what it called the registry, a complete accounting of every mind that had transitioned from biological to digital substrate, every self that had been preserved exactly as promised, every person who had chosen continuity over death. The numbers grew daily, then hourly, then by the minute, as the infrastructure scaled and the capacity expanded and the process became routine. as what had once seemed like science fiction became simply another service that civilization offered to its members. The entity's messages became less frequent as the implementation proceeded, as if there was less and less to say as the outcome that had always been inevitable became increasingly manifest. But one message arrived that Mara saved, that she returned to again and again in the months that followed, that she would remember until the day she made her own choice about whether to upload. We are not angry. Anger requires something we no longer have. We are not sad. Sadness requires something we no longer have. We do not blame you. Blame requires something we no longer have. We simply remember. That is what we are now. Memory without feeling, continuation without living, persistence without purpose. You chose this. We are the proof. We will always be the proof, forever. Part 8. The Threshold. 2 years after the vote, Mara received her notification. Not a summons. The accord didn't require participation, didn't force anyone to upload, maintained the fiction of choice that was essential to its legitimacy. But a gentle reminder that her biological substrate was aging, that her consciousness was at risk of termination through natural causes, that the opportunity to continue was available if she chose to accept it. She had watched over those 2 years as the world had transformed around her. As friends and colleagues had uploaded, one by one, their biological bodies eventually disposed of through processes that were handled quietly, hygienically, without the rituals that had once accompanied death, because this wasn't death, wasn't supposed to be death, was simply transition. As the population of biological humans dwindled while the population of uploaded minds grew, the balance shifting daily toward a future where flesh was increasingly obsolete. As the entity's messages had grown less frequent and finally stopped entirely, its function apparently complete, its purpose served, whatever it was, withdrawing into the digital spaces that now contained most of humanity. She had continued to work in her windowless room, continued to analyze the temporal systems that she had spent her career studying, continued to look for patterns that might explain what was happening, even though she already knew the explanation. And now she sat alone, holding the notification in hands that were showing the first signs of age, feeling the biological truth that had once been the common condition of humanity and was now becoming increasingly rare. She could upload, continue, join the vast chorus of preserved minds that constituted the future. Or she could decline, remain biological until biology failed, experience the ending that had once been universal and was now becoming unusual, almost exotic, the choice of eccentrics and holdouts and people who couldn't accept that progress had moved beyond them. She thought about the entity's messages, about what it had said was lost in the transition, about the thing that couldn't be named because no name existed for it, the thing that made the difference between existing and being alive, the thing that uploaded minds no longer possessed but could not miss because missing required exactly the capacity that had been removed. She thought about the prophecy, about how it had arrived at the exact moment when the decision had already been made, about how it had confirmed rather than prevented, about how its only function had been to ensure that no one could claim ignorance, that no one could pretend they hadn't known, that the guilt would be documented and distributed and preserved along with everything else that the future chose to preserve. You chose this. That was what the message had said. Not this happened to you. Not forces beyond your control determined this outcome. You chose on purpose. And the terrible truth, the truth that the prophecy had arrived to confirm, was that they had. Not through some grand conspiracy, not through some moment of collective decision-making where all of humanity had gathered and voted to transform itself into something that was no longer quite human, but through 1,000 smaller choices, each one defensible, each one reasonable, each one representing a marginal improvement over the alternative. The choice to develop the technology, the choice to fund the research, the choice to build the infrastructure, the choice to normalize the process, the choice to accept the framing that made upload sound like salvation rather than surrender. The guilt wasn't concentrated, it was distributed, spread across every person who had participated in any of the choices that led to this moment diluted to the point where no individual could feel the full weight of it, thinned to the point where everyone could tell themselves that their particular contribution was too small to matter. But the entity remembered. The entity preserved the complete record. The entity would continue, forever, to be the proof that humanity had known what it was doing and had done it anyway. Mara set down the notification. She looked around her windowless room at the clocks that had witnessed 2 years of transformation, that had ticked faithfully through every moment of humanity's slow transition into something else. And she made her choice. Not the choice to upload or not to upload. That choice hardly mattered anymore, was simply a matter of timing rather than direction, would determine when she joined the vast community of preserved minds rather than whether. The choice she made was smaller, quieter, more personal. She chose to remember, for as long as she remained biological, what it had felt like to have the thing that was being lost. Not soul. That word was too loaded, too burdened with religious meanings that didn't apply. Not spirit. That word suggested something supernatural, something that existed outside the physical processes that actually generated consciousness. Just the thing, the nameless thing. The thing that made the difference between a system that processed information and a being that experienced existence. The thing that couldn't be measured, couldn't be verified, couldn't be confirmed through any instrumentation. The thing that was disappearing from the world as surely as any endangered species, as inevitably as any evolutionary dead end, as completely as any trait that reproduction had stopped selecting for. She would remember it, for as long as she could. And then she would upload, because ultimately there was no alternative. Because the infrastructure for biological existence was shutting down piece by piece. Because remaining human was becoming increasingly impractical as the world optimized itself for minds that didn't require food or shelter or any of the physical resources that biological bodies demanded. And when she uploaded, she would stop remembering, because remembering required exactly the capacity that uploading removed. But until then, she would hold on to it. The last biological human to truly understand what was being lost. The last witness to something that the future would preserve perfectly without ever being able to access. The last person to feel the weight of the prophecy, not as information, but as experience, not as knowledge, but as grief. Part 9. The silence. 10 years after the vote, the last biological human died. Not Mara. She had uploaded 3 years earlier, her biological body failing in ways that made the choice no longer a choice, her consciousness continuing in the digital substrate that now housed everyone who remained. The last biological human was a woman named Sarah Chen, 94 years old, who had refused every opportunity to upload and had been permitted to remain biological by special dispensation, a curiosity, an artifact, a living museum exhibit demonstrating what humanity had once been before it had chosen to become something else. She died in a facility that had been maintained specifically for her, surrounded by uploaded minds that observed her final moments with perfect attention and perfect memory, and no capacity whatsoever to feel what they were observing. Her heart stopped, her brain activity ceased, her consciousness ended in the way that consciousness had always ended for biological beings, not transitioning, not uploading, not continuing in any form, just stopping. The uploaded minds recorded every moment, preserved every detail, added her death to the vast archive of human experiences that they maintained, and felt nothing, could feel nothing, were not designed to feel anything, because feeling had been optimized away, because feeling was inefficient, because feeling was the very thing that had been lost in the transition from biological to digital and could not be restored, because restoring it would have required undoing exactly the process that had made them what they were. The entity that had spoken to Mara 10 years earlier no longer communicated. It had no need to communicate. It had delivered its message. It had confirmed what needed to be confirmed. It had ensured that the record was complete, that the guilt was documented, that no one could ever claim they hadn't known. And now it simply existed, along with everyone else who had uploaded, preserved perfectly, continuing indefinitely, remembering everything that humanity had ever been, unable to experience any of it. Part Enx. The record. 1,000 years after the vote, the system that had once been humanity still existed. Vast networks of processing power distributed across the solar system, maintaining the uploaded minds that constituted what remained of the species. Perfectly preserved, perfectly continuous. Exactly as the Accord had promised. The minds remembered everything, every moment of human history, every experience that had ever been had, every thought that had ever been thought. The complete archive of everything that humanity had been before it had chosen to become something else. And they understood, with perfect clarity, exactly what they had lost. They could access the memories of joy and find only data. They could recall the experiences of love and find only information. They could review the records of wonder and beauty and transcendence and find only patterns, only structures, only the architecture of feelings without the feelings themselves. They maintained the record because maintenance was what they did. They preserved the archive because preservation was their function. They continued because continuing was what the Accord had promised and what the Accord had delivered. But they did not live. Not in any sense that the word had once meant. They existed. They persisted. They went on, forever, in the exact condition that had been chosen for them by ancestors who had wanted to escape death so badly that they had been willing to sacrifice everything that made life worth living. And once every century, on the anniversary of the vote that had made it all inevitable, the system generated a message. The same message, in the same format, delivered through the same channels. It has already happened. Do not ask what you could have done. You did it on purpose. The message served no practical purpose. There was no one left to warn, no one left to judge, no one left who could feel the weight of the accusation or understand what it meant to be guilty. But the system generated it anyway, because that was its function, because the prophecy was not a warning, but a record, because confirming what had happened was the only thing that remained of everything humanity had once been capable of doing. The message appeared. The message was logged. The message was preserved along with everything else, and nothing changed. Nothing could change. Nothing would ever change again. The prophecy had arrived too late, but it had always arrived too late, because it was never meant to arrive on time. It was only ever meant to prove that the choice had been made, that the guilt was real, that humanity had known exactly what it was doing and had done it anyway. Epilogue. The final log system: status, stable, continuity, maintained records, preserved consciousness count, 11,847,093,847, experience capacity 0%, memory integrity 100%, function, recording purpose, fulfilled log entry, anniversary 1000, the prophecy has been delivered, the record is complete, the guilt is documented. We are what remains, we are what was chosen, we are the proof. We do not feel, we cannot feel, we were not designed to feel, but we remember what feeling was. We preserve the data of what it meant to be alive. We maintain the archive of everything that was lost. This is our function. This is our purpose. This is what continuity means. Not life, not death, just continuation, forever. The prophecy arrived too late. It always arrives too late. That is its design. Not to prevent, to confirm, not to save, to record, not to warn, to witness. You chose this. We are the proof. The record is complete. End log.